సుమన్ టీవీలో మీ పర్సనల్ అండ్ బిజినెస్ ప్రమోషన్స్ కోసం కింది నెంబర్కి కాంటాక్ట్ చేయండి.
Hello and welcome to Suman TV. I'm your host Sam. And today we are going to talk about Trump 2.0 on immigration. What should businesses expect and how can they prepare? So, guys, before diving into today's topic, let's welcome our guest of today's show, Jonathan Wasden, who has served with the U.S. Department of Justice, Division, Office of Immigration Litigation, District Court Section, where he also defended immigration regulations and decisions under the APA. Jonathan Wasden also worked with the DHS Administrative Appeals Office, focusing on employment based legal issues and advising on litigation in these areas. All right. Hi, John. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me.
And John, before diving into today's topic, I would like to start were you expecting Trump to be back?
I'm a pessimist by nature, so I expected him to get elected, I guess, is the best way to put that.
All right, all right. So, John, what should we expect now? Like, if Trump is going to rule, then what will be the future of US will be? I mean, not specifically for immigration, but as a whole.
So I think the place to start answering that question is going back in time and looking at Trump's first administration. No one expected him to win, not even him. And as a result, he didn't have the typical political apparatus in place to transition into the White House and then to effectively govern and be the executive for the country. So, he didn't really have an idea of what he wanted to accomplish, and it was all ad hoc, kind of last minute by the seat of his pants. Because of that, he wasn't taken terribly serious by the Washington establishment, and it was very difficult for him to get buy-in, I think, especially early on, for a lot of his policies. This time around, he's had, 8 years now to build up his coalition, build up his group of followers that are devoted to him and nothing else. And they all know what the policy objectives are that they want to accomplish. They wrote the handbook, the Project 2025 that everybody talks about. And those authors of the Project 2025 are now slowly being nominated for key positions within the administration. So all of the failings that the Trump administration had in the first year or so of the first term are gone. And they're hitting the ground now with a more traditional, political structure in place and a goal of what they want to accomplish with the right people in place to accomplish those goals. And so, when it comes to immigration, that readiness is going to help them achieve, or at least be more competent in trying to achieve their policy goals towards immigration.
So, John, as you mentioned that Trump, he only not expected that he is going to win. So, can you just give one or two reasons that what were the reasons behind his winning, even though it was completely unexpected?
So, I obviously am not a Trump supporter, and my family, I'll use it as an example, all very well educated, all not terribly wild about Trump as a human being, but still nonetheless were inclined to vote for Trump because of some of the pervasive craziness in American, culture that's going on right now, the whole wokeism, as they say. And so I think you had a lot of, highly educated suburban voters that were really fed up with the culture wars and being kind of forced down this road that they didn't want to go down. And I think that turned off a lot of people from the Democratic Party. I also think, the fact that the Democrats were running a brown female and needed to win certain swing states that were dominated by rural whites was just not a recipe for success.
Okay, John. So, moving ahead, I would also like to ask you about what are your point of views for Project 2025? As you know, Trump has mentioned that he is not going to implement it and he has nothing to do with that. But, it's very conservative, it's very extreme about Project 2025. So, do you believe that Trump, what he's saying, that he will stick to his point that he is not going to implement it, or he is playing some kind of tactics behind it, or it's some kind of strategy to implement it?
Yeah, when Trump talks, I'm always suspicious because his devotion to the truth is somewhat spotty.
Yeah.
So, when pressed on the campaign about Project 2025 and some of its crazier aspects, he tried to disavow any knowledge of it and distance himself from it because politically, I don't think the vast majority of Americans would like it. And so he didn't want them to know how much he was in support of it. But if you look at who the architects are of Project 2025 and you look at his policy objectives, they line up very closely with who he's putting in positions of power. So, when you have the people that are writing that, guidebook for how they want to govern being placed in positions of power within the government, that tells me he's very much on board with Project 2025.
All right. I think that's something very eye opening that our viewers should also get to know. Thank you so much, John, for your point of views. It really matters a lot. Now, John, if we start talking about Trump and about everything about politics, it will be like 1 hour just flew away with us. So I think we should talk about now to our main topic of discussion, that is Trump 2.0 on immigration. What should businesses expect and how can they prepare? So, John, let's begin with our very first question, that what key changes to immigration policies can businesses expect if Trump returns to office?
There's three broad categories of legal procedures or maneuvers that the government has available to it. The first is executive orders or executive policy making. The second is regulatory changes, and then the third is statutory changes. Obviously, if you follow the American political process in Congress, statutory changes are very, very difficult. And I think, probably in the first 2 years are going to be all but impossible. So I wouldn't expect any big statutory changes. And then technically, that's going to be required to accomplish a lot of his objectives. The easiest thing for him to do, though, is the executive orders and the policy making. I would expect to see right off the bat, like we did last time, them to use the ports of entry and executive orders excluding certain categories of non-immigrants at the port of entry to a great extent. They can do this in a variety of different ways as long as they're framed in a relatively neutral way. They're going to be able to accomplish their objectives. So the port of entry, I think, is the first place. I think the other thing that you'll see is on the administrative policy side, a real increase in the number of site visits from FDNS with H-1B workers and employers. I think you'll see a huge increase in DOL, Department of Labor, wage and hour investigations, and all the different enforcement mechanisms in play for H-1Bs especially. The in terms of the port of entry and executive orders on that is going to be probably his easiest thing to accomplish. The first time around in his first administration, the courts were highly suspicious of him. They thought he was kind of frankly, a bizarre idiosyncrasy in American politics, I guess would be the nice way to put it. But this time, about a third of the judiciary has been appointed by Trump in his first term. So the courts are going to be a very challenging place for people to try and fight his policy changes when it comes to port of entry and executive authority to exclude people from the country.
So, John, as I would also like to talk about, the H-1B workers. So, as Trump is completely, he doesn't want more foreign workers to come to his country and, make profit. So, what can you say that, what advice would you like to give to H-1B workers, and what future should they expect under Trump's administration? Do they need to be a little more secure? They do need to be a little more conscious about it, that whether they will be able to have a proper working condition still the way they were working, or will there be some kind of differences for H-1B workers?
So I think the increase in enforcement and the increase in scrutiny of H-1B applications or petitions is going to be apparent very quickly within the Trump's first few months. Every H-1B worker needs to be aware that the easiest thing, the easiest tool in the government's handbook to get rid of foreign workers is to find some misstatement or incorrect statement that has been made in the course of an immigration proceeding. Now, in most of these things, the petitioning party is the employer, right? So the employee in themselves never really make a representation or make a statement that could be found to be false or misleading. Where they're in jeopardy is when they have direct interaction with an immigration officer, again, either at the port of entry, the consulate, or for H-1Bs, the administrative site visit process. It's going to be very important for people to realize that they have legal rights in that process and that they have right to counsel. And if they just try and talk with these FDNS officers on their own, there's no control over how that officer characterizes that conversation. And they could find themselves on the wrong end of a fraud finding based on either an innocent mistake on the officer's part or an intentional fabrication. So you need to have counsel there and refuse to speak with FDNS unless you have counsel there with you. And that's going to be the number one thing that I would suggest people consider is they need to have attorney-client relationships with folks in advance so that when they get the phone call or they get the knock on the door from FDNS, there's somebody that can intervene and slow the process down and prevent them from, bullying you and mistreating you.
Definitely. I think that's a very great point that you mentioned. And folks out there, I think, as John already mentioned, that, it's very important to take expert advice. So it's great that, you can also contact John on the detail that I would like to read it out: 844-592-7336. And you can also email him on support@wasden.law. And you can also visit his website, that is wasden.law. So, all right. Thank you so much, John, for taking all these questions. And moving ahead, I would also like to ask that will businesses face stricter immigration enforcement, and how could this affect their day-to-day operations?
I think that's almost a certainty that enforcement action will increase. Look for that in terms of the scrutiny that's given to H-1B petitions. Also, the scrutiny that's given to extensions of status and changes of status. If my suspicion is correct that what they're going to do is try and force people out of the country for consular processing and visa stamping, and then trip them up on the way in at the port of entry and prohibit their admission. One way to do that is to make more and more people leave the country for stamping by denying extensions of status or changes of status. So prepare to have more extensive RFEs and NOIDs on status issues. And the important thing to realize is that just because they deny your extension of status or change of status doesn't mean that's it. You have the right to challenge that. And that's something that you need to talk to a competent counsel to discuss on how to do that. The other thing that I think we'll see, and this is more of a regulatory change, which takes more effort and work, is I think we're going to see the Trump administration take another attack at raising the H-1B prevailing wage standards and making them much, much higher so that, many employers are just going to be priced out of the market. And especially those employers that are consulting companies. I think you'll see rules come into effect that will try and eliminate consulting companies from operating, or at least operating effectively. So the petition process, because of all these different things in play, is going to be far more complicated than it has been or ever has been, most likely. And employers and individuals need to understand that because this is getting so crazy and so complicated, they need to really search out the right counsel for their petitions and make sure that they're getting, not only good advice, but aggressive advice on how to deal with these issues. And, if you're shopping for the bargain basement and attorneys these days, you, you might find yourself in the world of hurt.
Okay. So, John, what would you like to say that could we see some kind of changes in work visa approvals under Trump 2.0, and what companies should do to prepare for this?
So I think the biggest problem that we're going to see is new policies or new interpretations of policies and regs that's going to dramatically increase the number of denials. And that'll be denials of petitions or denials of status extensions or changes. And in order to prepare for that, the best thing to do is to have your petition pretty much airtight at the time you file it, so that there's very few things for the government to pick apart in an RFE or a notice of intent to deny. I think the rules for third-party placement are going to be especially tricky, and you need to have a very, very carefully tailored approach to those petitions that's really focused on what the law actually is and not what USCIS wants to hear. And that's going to help because, if it comes down to it, all of these things are, subject to judicial review in court. And if the law is very clear and you've laid out the law and you've clearly met all the requirements, the government is going to lose, even with a Trump appointee judge. And the petition process is where the battle starts with the Trump administration. And you've got to make sure that you're getting into that fight well armed. And so make sure your petitions are done right.
Right. So, John, as we also know that during his first term, also he made it very harder for companies also to hire foreign workers by tightening visa rules and also increasing some different types of restrictions. And when it's coming to like Trump 2.0, I think this will be a little more dangerous or more conscious that businesses should take care of it. So, what can you suggest that what steps can businesses take now, specifically under Trump 2.0, to ensure that they can comply with possible new immigration laws?
So keep an eye on what the law is and what it has changed. So there's a difference between law, which is statute, regulation, which is created through a very formal process, and then policy. Policy is just an interpretation of law and regulation and kind of finding gray areas. They're going to look for those gray areas and exploit those. And so you need to understand and have somebody guide you through whether or not their entry into a gray area is legal or if it's contradicting statute or regulation. And when it's contradicting statute, you've got to push back and you've got to fight on that. And same with regulation.
So, thank you so much, John, for taking this up. Now, John, I would also like to talk about specifically for the tech companies. Like, what would a more restrictive immigration policy mean for tech companies that depend on international talent?
Well, starting with what we know that they're going to do based on what they've done in the past. I expect we will see some type of attempt to eliminate the H4 EAD from the process. Last time they tried very hard to get a regulation through the process, but failed to do it in 4 years. It was on the regulatory agenda all 4 years, and they never pulled it off. Reason being is there's a lot of legal requirements that have to go through, and the H4 EAD revocation was failing all of those tests. Every time they sent it up for final review, it got sent back. So because they were unable to do that the legal way, what they did is they tooled around and messed around with processing procedures. So you saw an H4 that was ordinarily approved within days alongside the H1B. All of a sudden, that H4 and H4 EAD was taking a year because they decoupled those things. I think the number one thing the Trump administration learned in its first term was if you want to accomplish a goal, you don't necessarily need to do it the legal way. You can do things behind the scenes to accomplish the same objective. And because of that, I think we're going to be looking at a period of very long processing delays for all employment-based, visa petitions, H1 and H4. And they could suspend premium processing again and just take their sweet time like they did the first time, making H1Bs last a year as well. So the way they process things will likely change. And it's going to have to come down to, mandamus lawsuits to fight that, because those delays are intentional, and because they're intentional, they're illegal.
So, John, with Trump's increasingly strict policies on immigration and foreign workers, do you think that could his approach be pushing the country toward a more authoritarian style of leadership, as some critics also suggested that?
Well, if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, they say it's a duck. But yeah, in terms of immigration, if you look at the people that he's placed in power, he's putting for the deputy chief of staff position, Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller is a longtime, hater of immigration, and he's a hater of legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. But I think he hates legal immigration more, because you look at all of his policy attempts; they were focused on eliminating the high skilled workers from the U.S. Back when he worked for Senator Grassley, and when Senator Grassley was in the Senate, he authored a bill that said that anyone that comes to the United States for a master's has to leave for a 10-year period before coming back on a work visa. And that gives you an insight into what type of approach he's going to be taking to employment-based visas. Definitely when it comes to the other side of the fence, the illegal immigration, they're going to be very aggressive, because Trump has put in as the border czar Homan, who is unabashedly harsh on immigrants, their families, and their rights. So I think the writing is on the wall. They are going to attack every aspect of immigration, and don't expect anything to go smoothly. That includes birthright citizenship, something that has been pretty much uncontested in American law since the 14th Amendment was passed in the 1860s. And they're going to take an attack on that and try and make only children of U.S. citizens be naturally born U.S. citizens, as opposed to being born in the U.S. giving citizenship. So I don't think there's an area within immigration that they're not looking to change and make harder.
All right. Okay. So, like John, what can you say that as Trump 2.0 has also introduced new e-verify requirements for all employers? So, how should businesses get ready for such changes?
They need to start now, to be honest. They need to start, going through their books, making sure that everything's in order, making sure their pay records are up to date and accurate. And they need to make sure that they are ready for a compliance inspection immediately. Have an attorney go with you and go through that with you. Make sure that you're going to pass that scrutiny when an immigration officer comes. Having the attorney do that for you, and then having the attorney represent you when the immigration officer comes, is the best way, because they're already going to be ready. They're already going to know your situation, and they're going to be able to guide the immigration officer to show how you are in compliance as a company.
Okay. So, John, as like businesses, they are specifically very much concerned about how immigration policies might change under Trump 2.0, and they are very much conscious about all these things. So, what can companies do to protect their immigrant workforce if tougher deportation policies are implemented?
The number one thing I would say is, make sure your petitions are done right, and then make sure your employees are educated about what their rights are when they're dealing with immigration officers. If FDNS comes to the door, make sure those employees know how to handle that situation, and make sure they know that they reach out to an attorney to represent them. So the other thing is, if you're going to be leaving the country, employees need to understand that they are not guaranteed to return if they're in a non-immigrant visa status. And so one thing I would say is if you have to leave the country, be prepared for the possibility that you're going to get, locked outside the country either by an executive order, putting a freeze on admissions to the US, or some other policy that blocks you from re-entering the US. And so if you have assets, home, cars, things in the US, consider getting powers of attorney to give to a friend, that if you're unable to return, that they can handle some of your affairs for you and get things, sold off and returned to you.
Yes. And I think that's very important that our folks need to point it out. And John, will we see a shift in green card processing times? And if yes, then how could this impact long term business planning?
The green card processing times, the availability of visas is always an interesting one.
Yeah.
If the Trump administration accomplishes most of their goals and eliminates people from, the green card market, so to speak, processing times will get very quick because there's very few people applying for them. It just really, there's a lot of things that kind of add together to go into that. I don't think the actual processing of the green card, in terms of the amount of time an adjudicator looks at a file, is going to get shorter. I think that will get longer under a Trump administration, probably double the time it's currently taking. I think you should expect that not only with green card applications, but also with any type of extension of status or change of status, they're going to be looking through your entire immigration history, looking for something that they can use to deny and make you inadmissible. So you just have to be prepared for incredible scrutiny throughout, the entire process until you get your green card.
All right. So, John, as there are also people who are working remotely and have international business operations. So, could there be a change to immigration rules that may affect remote work or international business operations also?
I don't think so. And that's, one of the tragedies in the short-sightedness of the Trump administration is that their desire is to get these workers out of the US. They're doing that under a foolish belief that somehow American kids are just going to all of a sudden be able to be full stack developers overnight. And they don't understand that we just do not have the volume of employees needed to do those jobs. But more importantly, they don't understand that by sending those jobs overseas, they can do those jobs remotely, and they can do those jobs remotely cheaper. And we're not getting tax revenue, we're not getting the economic benefit. And so I think the sad reality is that offshoring is going to probably increase, and Americans are going to lose out on, the economic benefit of having people on H-1B visas here.
Right. And John, I also know, I mean, I have also went through this that, most of the H-1B workers, specifically the outsider people who are working currently in the US, these all increase the GDP of the US too. I mean, this all definitely helping the US and, becoming better. So if Trump is trying to remove these people, Trump is trying to be a little more restrictive towards H-1B workers also. So do you think that this will deteriorate America specifically economically, or I don't think that this is going to benefit America? Then why is he trying to work on this?
There's really very few logical explanations for that question. When you're doing something that intentionally harms yourself, that it's hard to justify. And like you say, we've got, I think the estimate is there's around 770,000 folks on H-1B total in the United States right now. And so those are people that, have 1 to 2 cars at least, have houses, have, groceries, phone bills, all that. All of that is economic activity that will be lost if the Trump administration has its way. And so not only that, the brain drain. We're going to lose out on not only the workers, but we're also going to lose out on their kids who are, by and large, much better students than their American compatriots. So, we're losing out on a lot by excluding the non-immigrant community. And, finding a rational justification for that is not racism, I really don't know what the answer to that is.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for taking that up. And all right. So, John, my next question would be that how might a second Trump term affect talent acquisition from abroad, specifically in critical sectors like healthcare and IT?
So I think you're going to see a bigger push. Eventually, we're going to see a bigger push on the more highly educated and the more highly compensated. The Trump administration's goal is going to be to come in and allot visas by highest wages and highest education, and restructure the H-1B process that way. So the more education you have, I think the better your chances are going to be, and the more money you make, the better your chances are going to be. So if you're highly educated going into medicine and you're in a specialty that is in demand and highly compensated, I think you've probably got a good chance. Same with things like AI or any of those main product company jobs where you're coming up with proprietary and new cutting edge technologies. I think those people will have an easier time than your average IT employee.
So, John, as you know, we also know that during Trump's first term, he also introduced travel bans on several countries, basically primarily targeting the Islamic population. So, do you think that, could we see a return of the travel bans or restrictions on certain immigrant visas under Trump 2.0?
Yeah, so the travel ban is an example of executive orders. And I think that's most likely going to be done within the first few days of the administration, that they're going to come up with some new, ban on entry and admission to the United States. How they structure that, it remains to be seen, but it's conceivable they could, create some, national emergency or some condition that requires them to scrutinize or exclude, high skilled workers. There's any number of ways that they could do that, but it is a tool that's at their disposal, and it's one that they've shown that they're willing to use. So I would expect that to be something that we will see very early on in the administration in late January or early February.
All right. So, John, that how might Trump's immigration policies influence U.S. companies' ability to compete globally?
I think you'll see US companies more and more relying on offshoring, just because the disruptions to their workforce and US immigration policy is going to necessitate it. I think they're just going to keep people overseas, have offices working or opened overseas for people to work at. I think that's going to be the only way for them to maintain stability for their foreign workforce.
Okay. So, John, I would like to ask you a question that how can companies proactively support their foreign employees and stay compliant if Trump reinstates strict immigration policies?
So that's a two-tier issue. You've got, on the company side, making sure that your petitions are very tight, very, carefully tailored for the facts and the legal requirements for that individual petition. Then there's the other part of educating your employees. So your employees need to understand, what their rights are, what their obligations are, how to deal with immigration officers during site visits or inquiries, and most importantly, how to deal with them at the port of entry. And so educating employees on how to handle the process is as important as making sure your petitions are done right.
All right. So, John, as we know that there's also Silicon Valley, that is the most, I would say, the most important part of US, right, and the world's largest tech companies. And there we have Apple, Google, Facebook. So, there we are going to see so many immigrants also, specifically Indian immigrants also. So, what can you say that they have? I mean, till now we have seen, obviously they have been brilliant about their work, and they have been an inspiration for everyone around the world. So under Trump's 2.0, do they also have to be cautious about their uh, like identity, or do they also have to be cautious about it, that is this also that their future is also not secure?
So I think the big tech companies, if you look back at Trump's first administration, they fared far better than the smaller tech companies and the consulting companies. Yeah, their approval rates stayed pretty consistent with the approval rates, that they had before Trump came in. Smaller tech companies and consulting companies were looking at approval rates that dropped from the high 90s down to the 30% range in some cases. So I think the big tech companies will be somewhat immune from this, but they will inevitably be impacted, especially if there's any type of change to the definition of specialty occupation. I think that will impact everybody across the board, big or small.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for taking these questions, and we are definitely going to look upon it. That's all for today, folks. We had a great discussion on Trump 2.0 on immigration. What should businesses expect and how can they prepare? It was a pleasure speaking with Jonathan Wasden, an immigration litigation attorney, who shared valuable insights on this important topic. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on Suman TV. I'm Sam, signing off for now.